I was elbow-deep in the delicate guts of a 1964 Rolleiflex when my phone buzzed with the news that my grandmother had died. My hands didn't even tremble. The tiny screwdriver remained steady between my fingers as I secured the last piece of the shutter mechanism. The soft click oddly satisfying against the hollow emptiness spreading through my chest. "You're not crying," said Marcus, my gallery owner friend who delivered the news in person after I'd ignored 3 calls. He stood awkwardly by my workbench, rainwater still dripping from his coat onto my hardwood floors. "I'm working." I didn't look up. The camera deserved my full attention, unlike grandmother, who'd left me nothing but a name too heavy to carry and a childhood too fragile to remember. The client needs this tomorrow. The truth was, I'd rehearsed this moment for years. The call, the news, the supposed grief. But now it was here. All I felt was the cool metal between my fingers and the distant realization that I should probably feel something more. The rain against my workshop windows picked up intensity, drumming an irregular heartbeat that mine couldn't seem to match. 3 days of downpour had turned Glendale into a glistening, melancholy painting, fitting weather for newly minted orphans. "Rose," Marcus sighed. "You should at least go to the funeral." "There won't be one. She donated her body to science." I finally looked up, practical to the end. I set down the Rolleiflex and reached for my loupe, examining the precision of my work rather than the concern in Marcus's eyes. The restoration shop smelled of metal polish and cleaning solution, my sanctuary of fixable things. "I'm opening the new exhibition next Friday," Marcus said, changing tactics. "Including that spot we reserved for your personal collection. People are excited to see what Rose Powell's been hiding all these years." My fingers tightened around the loop. My collection wasn't ready, might never be ready. Every photograph I'd taken felt like exposing a nerve. "I'll be there," I promised automatically, though we both knew my personal work would remain locked away. After Marcus left, I closed the workshop early and walked 3 blocks to Henderson's Antiques, drawn by habit rather than intention. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, shaking raindrops from my hair. That's when I saw her, flame red hair catching the vintage lamplight as her fingers trailed reverently across the glass case. And there, beneath her perfectly manicured fingertips, sat the camera I'd been hunting for 2 years, a 1930 seconds Leica, in remarkably preserved condition. I moved toward it without thinking, muscle memory from 1,000 antique shops guiding me. Our hands reached the display case simultaneously, her deep brown eyes meeting my blue ones with surprise, then recognition, the look of one specialist identifying another. "Exquisite craftsmanship," she said, her voice warm like aged whiskey. "Remarkable condition," I replied, somehow unable to look away from her face. The shopkeeper approached, eyeing us both with amusement. "Ah, I see you've both found our newest acquisition. Just came in yesterday." The redhead extended her hand. "Taylor Ward, I collect." "Rose Powell," I answered, her hand firm in mine. "I restore." Something electric passed between us in that moment, a current of shared understanding that ran deeper than professional courtesy. I caught the scent of her perfume, something expensively subtle with notes of sandalwood. "How fortuitous," she smiled, not releasing my hand. "Perhaps we were meant to find each other. I should have walked away then. Should have recognized the dangerous spark in those brown eyes. Should have known that the day my grandmother died wasn't the day to start something new. But I didn't know then what I know now, that Taylor Ward would eventually hand me both salvation and destruction, packaged neatly in a vintage camera case with my name on it. I spent the entire morning reorganizing my workshop before Taylor arrived. 3 times I rearranged the precision tools on my workbench. Twice I swept the already clean floor. Once I caught myself checking my reflection in a polished silver reflector. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, adjusting the thermostat again. The autumn chill had settled into Glendale overnight, transforming the rain into a crisp electric atmosphere that matched my nerves. When the door chimed at precisely 2 p.m., I was pretending to be absorbed in calibrating a light meter. Taylor entered like she belonged there, carrying the Leica in a velvet pouch and wearing a cream cashmere sweater that somehow made her red hair look even more vibrant. "Your space is exactly how I imagined it," she said, eyes sweeping the workshop with genuine appreciation. "Organized chaos with purpose." I gestured to the workbench where I'd cleared a space. "Shall we see what we've got?" Taylor placed the velvet pouch on the table with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Our compromise had been simple. I would restore the camera to working condition, and she would add it to her collection with the understanding that I could borrow it occasionally for special restoration projects. "Have you been restoring cameras long?" she asked, standing closer than necessary as I carefully unwrapped our shared treasure. "Since I was 19. Started with my father's old Nikon." I didn't mention that it was all I had left of him. Some details were still too tender to share with strangers. Though already, Taylor didn't quite feel like a stranger. I began the careful disassembly process, explaining each component as I worked. Taylor leaned in, her perfume, definitely sandalwood with something citrusy, enveloping me in a distracting cloud. "This rangefinder mechanism is nearly perfect," I said, trying to focus on the tiny brass components rather than the warmth of her body inches from mine. "German engineering at its—" Her hand brushed against mine as she reached to point at something, and my fingers slipped. The delicate lens assembly nearly tumbled from my grip. "Sorry," we both exclaimed at once, hands colliding again as we both moved to catch it. I rescued the lens, but felt heat rising to my cheeks. In 15 years of restoration work, I'd never fumbled a component. "Perhaps I should give you some space," Taylor said, though she didn't move away. Instead, her eyes locked with mine, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's fine," I managed, returning to the disassembly with forced concentration. "Just haven't had an audience in a while." The afternoon stretched into evening as we worked. Or rather, as I worked and Taylor watched, asking surprisingly insightful questions about restoration techniques. The shop grew darker around us, until only my work lamps illuminated our small island of focused attention. "You should see this," I said finally, stepping back from the workbench. The Leica sat reassembled, its brass and black enamel gleaming under the lamp. "Try the shutter." Taylor's fingers caressed the camera before pressing the shutter release. The mechanism responded with a crisp, perfect click that might as well have been a symphony for the smile it brought to her face. "Beautiful," she whispered, turning the camera over in her hands. "You're an artist, Rose." "I just fix things," I demurred, suddenly aware of how late it had become. The workshop windows reflected our images against the darkness outside. "Want to grab a late dinner?" Taylor asked, carefully returning the Leica to its pouch. "I know a place that stays open for night owls and insomniacs." I hesitated, thinking of my empty apartment and the stack of condolence cards I'd been avoiding. "Why not?" Over plates of pasta at a tiny Italian restaurant, Taylor told me about her collection, how it started with her mother's Polaroid and grew into an obsession with preserving photography's technological evolution. "But you," she said, twirling pasta around her fork, "you actually make them live again. That's different." "Is that why you suggested sharing the Leica?" I asked. "To see it restored properly?" Taylor's eyes caught mine over her wine glass. "Partly, but mostly because I wanted an excuse to see you again." The confession hung between us, neither of us looking away. For the first time since my grandmother's death, hell, for the first time in years, I felt something crack open inside me. "I should be processing grief right now," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "My grandmother died yesterday." Taylor didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she reached across the table and lightly touched my hand. Sometimes life hands you an ending and a beginning in the same moment. I looked down at her fingers against mine, pale against olive skin, and wondered which one she would turn out to be. "Stop fidgeting, you look fine," Marcus said, adjusting the track lighting above the display case where our restored Leica now sat like royalty atop black velvet. "I'm not fidgeting," I lied, smoothing down my black dress for the 5th time. The gallery buzzed with pre-opening energy, waitstaff arranging champagne flutes, Marcus's assistant placing name cards beside the featured pieces. I'd invited Taylor to display the Leica alongside selections from her collection, creating a timeline of photographic evolution that would anchor the contemporary works on the walls. It was meant to be professional, collaborative, nothing more. So why did my stomach knot when I heard the door chime and saw her step inside? Taylor wore a deep emerald dress that made her red hair look like flames. She'd brought 3 additional cameras from her collection, each nestled in custom cases. Marcus welcomed her effusively. He'd been thrilled when I mentioned her name, apparently knowing her reputation in collector circles. "Your restoration work is even more impressive in this lighting," Taylor said, approaching me with those cameras. The familiar sandalwood scent wrapped around me as she leaned in to kiss my cheek in greeting. Her lips lingered a half-second too long. "Professional excellence only," I murmured, taking the cases from her. "Let's get these displayed before the crowds arrive." The gallery filled quickly with Glendale's art crowd, photographers, collectors, critics, and the wealthy patrons who kept places like this running. I found myself watching Taylor across the room, the way she moved with such practiced confidence among people who clearly knew her name. "She's quite something," Marcus commented, appearing at my elbow with champagne. "How exactly did you meet?" "Accidentally," I replied, accepting the glass. "Over a camera." And how accidental is her hand on your back right now?" Before I could respond, I felt the warm pressure of Taylor's palm precisely where Marcus had indicated. She'd materialized behind me, smiling at Marcus with perfect white teeth. "I'm stealing your photographer for introductions," she told him, gently guiding me away. "There are some people who would appreciate her expertise." Taylor led me to a cluster of collectors, all hanging on the words of a tall, silver-haired man whose tailored suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. He turned as we approached, eyes sharpening with interest. "Victor Monroe," Taylor said with practiced charm. "Meet Rose Powell, the restoration specialist I mentioned." Monroe extended his hand. His grip was cool and dry. "Fascinating work you do, Miss Powell, preserving history while making it functional again." Something in his tone made me uneasy. He spoke about the cameras like they were trophies rather than instruments of creation. "I understand you two collaborated on that Leica," Monroe continued, nodding toward our display. "Exquisite piece. Very valuable." "It's not for sale," Taylor and I said simultaneously. Monroe laughed, though his eyes remained calculating. "Everything has its price. If you ever reconsider, I have clients who would be extremely generous." After he moved on, Taylor leaned close to my ear. "Sorry about that. Victor can be intense about acquisitions." "Is he always so? Predatory?" She shrugged. "He's built his reputation on having what others can't." The evening progressed successfully by all measurable standards. Champagne flowed. Marcus sold 3 major photographs, and our vintage camera display drew consistent crowds. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of Monroe's eyes following our Leica throughout the night. By closing time, rain had begun to fall again, drumming against the gallery skylights. Most guests had departed, and Marcus was celebrating with his staff in the back office. "Share a cab?" Taylor asked, helping me pack away the smaller items from our display. "I'm just a few blocks away," I said. "I usually walk." "Then I'll walk with you," she replied, producing a compact umbrella from her purse. "It's pouring out there." We stepped into the rain-slicked streets, huddled together beneath her umbrella. Streetlights reflected in puddles, transforming Glendale into a shimmering mirror world. "I've been thinking about your grandmother," Taylor said suddenly. "Did you ever decide about the funeral?" The question caught me off guard. "There's nothing to decide. She made all the arrangements years ago. And you're okay with that?" I stopped walking. "Why wouldn't I be?" Taylor turned to face me, rain pattering on the umbrella above us. "Because sometimes what we think we feel and what we actually feel are different things." "Speaking from experience?" I challenged. "Yes." Her honesty disarmed me. "I've been telling myself I'm interested in you professionally, but that's not entirely true." My breath caught. Around us, the rain intensified, creating a private cocoon of sound. We stood before my apartment building, but neither of us moved toward the door. "I like you, Rose." Taylor's voice was soft but clear. "More than I expected to, and I hope it might be mutual." The proper response would have been to step back, maintain professional boundaries, protect the working relationship we'd established. Instead, I found myself studying the raindrops caught in her eyelashes, the slight uncertainty in her usually confident expression. "It might be," I admitted. She smiled then, stepping closer until the space between us disappeared. Her free hand came up to touch my cheek, thumb brushing away a raindrop. "Good night, Rose Powell," she whispered, her lips ghosting across mine in a kiss so light it might have been imagined. Then she pressed the umbrella handle into my hand and stepped back into the rain, her red hair darkening as water soaked through it. I watched her walk away, umbrella forgotten in my hand, rain seeping through my dress, wondering what exactly I'd just set in motion. The pounding on my door yanked me from sleep like being dragged underwater. My phone showed 6:17 a.m., no calls, no texts, just the insistent hammering that suggested emergency. I stumbled to the door in my oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, hair sticking out in all directions. Taylor stood in the hallway, her perfect composure shattered. Rain-damp hair clung to her face, and her eyes were wide with panic. "They're gone," she gasped, pushing past me into the apartment. "The Leica, my Hasselblad, everything in the display case. Someone broke into the gallery overnight." My brain struggled to catch up. "What? When?" "Marcus called me 20 minutes ago. The alarm went off at 4 a.m., but by the time police arrived." She paced my small living room, hands trembling. "They're saying it looks suspicious. The timing, the specific items taken." "Suspicious how?" I asked, already reaching for jeans and a sweater. Taylor's voice dropped. "Rose, they're looking at us. Marcus told the police we had access, keys, alarm codes, that we conveniently brought the most valuable pieces together." My blood ran cold. "That's ridiculous. Marcus knows me. He's the one who suggested it might be an inside job." I froze with one arm in my sweater. Marcus had been my friend for years. He'd helped me establish my restoration business, sent clients my way, even attended my father's funeral. The betrayal stung like alcohol in an open wound. 20 minutes later, we pushed through a cluster of police officers at the gallery entrance. The place looked untouched except for the empty display case that had held our cameras. Marcus stood by his office door, face grim as he spoke with a woman in plain clothes. "There she is," he said when he saw me, his tone colder than I'd ever heard it. "Detective, this is Rose Powell, the restoration specialist I mentioned." The detective turned, revealing a stern face with shrewd eyes. "Detective Sandra Wells, I'd like to speak with you both separately." She led me to Marcus's office, while Taylor remained in the gallery with another officer. The small room felt airless and confining. "How long have you known Ms. Ward?" Wells began, pen poised over her notebook. "About 3 weeks. And in that short time, you decided to collaborate on displaying extremely valuable items?" I explained our chance meeting at the antique shop, the restoration arrangement, how the exhibition came together. Each fact sounded increasingly flimsy as I spoke. "So you met a stranger, agreed to co-own an expensive camera, then brought it and other valuable pieces to a public showing where their presence was widely advertised?" When she put it that way, it did sound suspicious. "It's not unusual in this business. Collectors display their pieces regularly. What is unusual," Wells continued, "is that someone bypassed a state-of-the-art alarm system with the correct codes, knew exactly which items to take and left no evidence." "You think I stole my own camera?" The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. "I think it's convenient that you and Miss Ward appeared in each other's lives just weeks before this heist. I think it's interesting that you both had access and opportunity." She leaned forward. "And I think it's notable that Mr. Green mentioned you've been struggling financially since your grandmother's death." My shock must have shown on my face because Wells nodded. "Yes. He told us about the inheritance issues, the studio mortgage." Marcus had thrown me to the wolves without hesitation. The realization was a physical pain in my chest. When Wells finally released me, I found Taylor in the main gallery, her face pale but composed. We exchanged glances as she was led to the office for her own interrogation. "Did you tell them about Victor Monroe?" I whispered as she passed. She paused. "Not yet. We need to be careful there." I waited outside, watching the crime scene technicians dust for prints they wouldn't find. If this was a professional job, they'd left nothing behind. When Taylor emerged 30 minutes later, her expression was thunderous. "Let's go," she said, taking my arm. "We need to talk somewhere private." We ended up at a diner 6 blocks away, tucked into a corner booth far from other customers. Taylor ordered coffee for both of us, though neither of us touched it. "They think we staged it," she said flatly. "Either for insurance fraud or to sell the pieces on the black market." "Marcus told them I needed money," I said. "About my grandmother's estate problems. He told them I have gambling debts." Her laugh was bitter. "I've never gambled in my life." I studied her across the table. This woman, who'd been a stranger weeks ago, and was now my only ally. Why would he do this? Maybe he's covering for himself. Maybe someone's pressuring him. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. Rose, we need to figure this out ourselves. The police aren't looking beyond us. I stared at our joined hands, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down. Everything I'd built could collapse, my reputation, my business, my future. And now Taylor's too, by association. We hardly know each other, I said quietly. Why are you staying? This could ruin you professionally. Taylor's fingers tightened around mine. Because I know a setup when I see one, and because, she hesitated, because I trust you. And right now, I think you need someone on your side. She was right. With Marcus's betrayal, I had no one else. I turned my hand over, properly lacing our fingers together. Okay, I said. Where do we start? We shouldn't be doing this, I whispered as Taylor kept lookout while I picked the gallery's side door lock. 2 days of police investigations had yielded nothing, and Marcus had stopped returning my calls. You still have legal access, Taylor reminded me. This isn't breaking and entering if you have keys. Which I'm not using because Marcus might have changed the locks, and we don't want to leave electronic evidence of entry. She glanced over her shoulder. Hurry up. The lock clicked open. For 15 years, I'd used these hands for painstaking restoration work. Turns out, the skills transferred nicely to lockpicking. We slipped inside, using flashlights instead of turning on overheads. The gallery felt different in darkness, less a showcase, more a mausoleum of empty pedestals and vacant wall space. Marcus had closed it temporarily following the theft. What exactly are we looking for? Taylor whispered, her breath warm against my ear. Anything the police missed. The cameras weren't just grabbed randomly. Somebody knew exactly what they wanted. We moved to the display case, now just an empty glass box. I ran my fingers along its edge, feeling for anomalies. Nothing. But as I knelt to examine the base, my flashlight caught something on the hardwood floor, a faint smudge barely visible against the dark finish. Taylor, look at this. She crouched beside me, our shoulders touching. What is it? I touched the smudge gently. Ammonium thiosulfate. It's a fixer chemical I use in restoration. Very specific. I sniffed my finger. And fresh. Could it have come from your workshop? On your clothes, maybe? I shook my head. I'm careful about cross-contamination. This shouldn't be here. So, either you're being framed, or someone's attempting to frame me but made a mistake. This chemical shouldn't be anywhere near these cameras. It's for photographic processing, not restoration. We photographed the evidence, then continued our search. In Marcus's office, we found nothing unusual until Taylor noticed a receipt wedged behind the filing cabinet. An invoice for security system maintenance dated just 2 days before the theft. He had the codes changed, she whispered, but told the police we still had valid access. Why would he do that unless he knew someone would need to bypass the system? Back at my apartment, we spread our findings across my kitchen table like detectives in a crime drama. Photos of the chemical residue, a copy of the security invoice Taylor had pocketed, printouts of similar thefts from other galleries. 3 cases in the last 18 months, Taylor said, tapping the printouts. All vintage cameras or photography equipment, all from private collections on temporary display. And look at the exhibition sponsors. I pointed to a recurring name, Monroe Acquisitions. Victor, Taylor breathed. But why would he steal what he could just buy? Maybe he tried to buy the Leica and we refused, I suggested. Or maybe it's not about owning the originals. Taylor was pacing now, energized. What if he's replacing them with forgeries? He could sell authentic pieces to private collectors while the owners display copies without knowing. It made a twisted kind of sense. Victor had the connections, the knowledge, and possibly the technical skill. What he needed was access to the originals to create convincing replicas. We need proof, I said, and we need to figure out Marcus's role. Taylor nodded, glancing at her watch. It's after midnight, we should get some rest. Only then did I realize how exhausted I was. The adrenaline of our amateur detective work faded, leaving bone-deep fatigue in its wake. You can take the bed, I'll sleep on the couch. Taylor looked at me for a long moment, then stepped closer. Don't be ridiculous, your couch is tiny, and we're both adults. I started to protest, but the thought of arguing took more energy than I possessed. We moved around each other awkwardly as we prepared for bed, Taylor borrowing a t-shirt, me pretending this was perfectly normal. In the darkness of my bedroom, we lay side by side, not touching but acutely aware of each other's presence. The sheets smelled of lavender detergent and Taylor's perfume, an intoxicating combination. "Do you think we'll clear our names?" she asked softly. "We have to," I replied, staring at the ceiling. "I can't lose my business. It's all I have." Taylor was quiet for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then I felt her hand find mine between us, her fingers intertwining with my own. "Not anymore," she whispered. I turned my head to look at her, just a silhouette in the darkness, red hair spread across my pillow. She shifted closer, and suddenly her lips were on mine, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. Logic said we should stop. We barely knew each other. We were suspects in a crime. Everything was complicated enough. Logic lost. My hands found her hair, her waist, the curve of her hip beneath my borrowed t-shirt. The world narrowed to sensation, her mouth exploring mine, her fingers tracing patterns on my skin, the soft sounds she made as we moved together. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the windows and drowning out everything but our shared breaths and whispered discoveries. Afterward, Taylor curled against me, her head on my shoulder. "That wasn't part of the investigation plan," she murmured against my skin. I laughed softly, running my fingers through her hair. "No, but I'm not filing any complaints." She raised herself on one elbow, her expression suddenly serious in the dim light. "Rose, whatever happens with this case, this isn't just about clearing our names for me anymore." The vulnerability in her eyes made my chest ache. I pulled her down for another kiss, trying to convey what I wasn't ready to say in words. We fell asleep tangled together, the evidence of our investigation forgotten on the kitchen table, the rain a steady backdrop to our breathing. For the first time since my grandmother died, since long before that really, I didn't feel alone. "A 1958 Hasselblad 500 Celsiuses, I explained to Taylor as I carefully polished the viewfinder. "Not as rare as our Leica, but still valuable enough to be tempting." It had been 3 days since our evidence-gathering excursion. 3 days of falling into a strange domestic rhythm. Taylor bringing coffee in the mornings, me cooking dinner in the evenings, both of us hunched over research and plans late into the night. "And you're sure you want to use your own camera as bait?" Taylor asked, concern etching her features. "It's perfect, valuable enough to attract attention, but not irreplaceable." I placed the camera in its custom case. "Besides, I've documented every scratch and serial number. If it disappears, we'll know exactly what we're looking for." Our plan was straightforward, if risky. Taylor would leverage her collector contacts to spread rumors about my recently restored Hasselblad, hinting at rare modifications that made it especially valuable. Then we'd attend a photography convention where Victor Monroe was scheduled to speak, making sure he overheard us discussing the camera. What if he doesn't take the bait? Taylor worried, packing her overnight bag. The convention was in San Diego, and we'd booked a hotel room for convenience. Then we're no worse off than before. I zipped my own bag. But he will. Men like Victor can't resist proving they're the smartest person in the room. The drive to San Diego gave us time to rehearse our roles. Taylor would play the enthusiastic collector, while I remained the reluctant restorer, hesitant to part with my masterpiece. "Just don't oversell it," I cautioned as we checked into our hotel. "Victor's sharp. If you seem too eager, he'll get suspicious." The first day of the convention passed without incident. We attended panels, networked with legitimate contacts, and positioned ourselves where Victor could observe us from afar. By evening, I was beginning to think our plan had failed, until we spotted him at the hotel bar, nursing a whiskey alone. "Now or never," Taylor whispered, squeezing my hand before leading me to the bar. We took seats 2 stools away from Victor, ordering drinks and initiating an animated conversation about restoration techniques. I opened my portfolio, deliberately displaying photos of the Hasselblad. "I still think you should consider that buyer from Chicago," Taylor said loudly enough for Victor to hear. His offer was generous. I shook my head. "It's not just about money. That camera represents months of work, sourcing parts, calibrating the mechanism." As if on cue, Victor glanced our way. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something darker: calculation. Miss Powell, Miss Ward, he said smoothly, moving to the empty stool between us. What a pleasant surprise. Mr. Monroe, I acknowledged coolly. I didn't realize you attended technical conventions. I find it valuable to stay current on restoration developments. His eyes flicked to my portfolio. May I? I hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant before sliding it toward him. He flipped through the Hasselblad photos with practiced nonchalance, but I caught the flash of interest in his eyes. Exceptional work, he murmured. This appears to be the V series with the upgraded viewfinder, very rare. 1 of 12 manufactured, I confirmed, the lye flowing easily. Victor signaled the bartender. Let me buy you both a drink. I feel we got off on the wrong foot at the gallery. 3 drinks later, our conversation had shifted from technical specifications to broader industry gossip. Victor proved surprisingly charming when he wanted to be, regaling us with inside stories about famous collectors and their eccentricities. The unfortunate events at your gallery, he said eventually, voice lowered with practiced concern. Have the police made any progress? Taylor tensed beside me, but I kept my expression neutral. Nothing concrete. They seem fixated on the wrong angles. Such valuable pieces, Victor sighed. It would be a tragedy if they simply vanished from the market. Like other stolen cameras have? Taylor asked innocently. Something dangerous flickered behind Victor's smile. The black market for such items is surprisingly robust. I've occasionally been approached to authenticate questionable pieces. I imagine with your reputation, many people seek your expert opinion, I said, maintaining eye contact. He studied me for a moment. Indeed. In fact, I've been considering expanding my services, perhaps a partnership with specialized restorers and collectors, people with flexible approaches to acquisition and authentication. There it was, the invitation we'd been waiting for. Flexible how exactly? Taylor asked, leaning closer. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. My suite has an excellent view of the harbor. In the elevator, Taylor gripped my hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. Victor pretended not to notice, commenting blandly on the convention speakers as we ascended to the top floor. His suite was opulent, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Diego skyline. Victor moved to a built-in bar, preparing drinks we hadn't requested. To new partnerships, he said, handing us each a glass. I sipped cautiously while Taylor launched into questions about Victor's collection. He answered vaguely, steering the conversation toward our Hasselblad again. I have a client who would pay handsomely for exclusive access to such a piece, he said finally. Not to purchase merely 2, study it for a few days. Study it? I raised an eyebrow. For academic purposes, Victor assured me, his smile tight. With generous compensation, of course. The alcohol had made my head fuzzy, my reactions sluggish. I realized too late that Victor had been pouring stronger drinks for us than for himself. I think we should discuss this tomorrow, Taylor interjected, noticing my discomfort. When we're all fresh. Victor's disappointment was barely concealed. Of course, sleep on it. I'm in suite 1542 if you reconsider. Somehow, we made it back to our room, Taylor supporting me as I stumbled from the elevator. He drugged the drinks, I slurred as she helped me to the bed. I know, she whispered, pulling off my shoes. But he revealed enough. He's definitely behind the gallery theft. I fell back against the pillows, the room spinning gently. Taylor crawled onto the bed beside me, her worried face swimming in and out of focus. You're beautiful, I mumbled, reaching up to touch her cheek. Did I tell you that? She smiled despite herself. You're high as a kite right now. Doesn't make it less true. Taylor leaned down and kissed me softly. Get some sleep. We'll figure out our next move in the morning. But as consciousness slipped away, one thought remained crystal clear. We were playing a dangerous game with a man who didn't like to lose. The aftermath of the convention felt like a hangover that wouldn't quit. We'd driven back to Glendale in tense silence, both processing Victor's thinly veiled proposition. I kept replaying his words in my head, looking for something we could use against him. He was careful, Taylor said as we pulled into my driveway. Never explicitly admitted to anything illegal. But the implication was clear. I grabbed my bag from the back seat. He wants the Hasselblad to create a forgery. The familiar comfort of my workshop should have been reassuring. But as I unlocked the door, something felt off. The air smelled different, not the usual mix of metal polish and cleaning solutions, but something sharper, chemical. "Someone's been here," I whispered, freezing in the doorway. Taylor pressed close behind me. "Are you sure?" I pointed to the workbench. My precision tools had been rearranged, not obviously, but enough that I noticed. The antique cabinet where I stored restoration chemicals was slightly ajar. "Should we call the police?" Taylor asked. "And tell them what? That someone moved my screwdrivers half an inch? We have no proof of anything." We searched the workshop thoroughly, but nothing seemed to be missing. Whoever had been here was looking for something specific, likely the Hasselblad we'd been discussing with Victor. "They'll be back," Taylor said, as we locked up and headed to my apartment upstairs. "I know." I dropped my keys in the dish by the door, suddenly exhausted. "Which means we need to move quickly." That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building had me sitting bolt upright, listening for intruders. Taylor insisted on staying, claiming the hotel was unnecessary now that we were back in Glendale. But I knew her real reason. "I'm not leaving you alone with Victor's people watching the place," she'd said firmly, unpacking the overnight bag she'd brought from the convention. By morning, shadows hung beneath both our eyes. I made coffee while Taylor called her industry contacts, quietly asking about any rare cameras suddenly appearing in private collections, particularly those authenticated by Victor Monroe. 4 confirmed cases, she reported, hanging up from her third call. All pieces that disappeared from public exhibitions in the last 2 years, all reappearing as previously unknown examples in private collections. "And all authenticated by Victor?" She nodded. "For substantial fees." I was about to respond when movement outside caught my eye. Through my kitchen window, I spotted a man in a dark jacket leaning against a car across the street, staring directly at my building. "We have company," I whispered, gesturing toward the window. Taylor glanced out, her expression hardening. "He's not even trying to be subtle. He wants us to know we're being watched." For the rest of the day, the man remained stationed outside. When darkness fell, he was replaced by another figure, this one taller, broader in the shoulders. The message was clear: we were under surveillance. "You can't stay here," I told Taylor that evening. "This is my mess. If Victor's people are watching, you should distance yourself." She looked at me like I'd suggested she cut off her own arm. "First, this is our mess. Second, I'm not going anywhere." "Taylor." "No." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I didn't sign up for half a partnership, Rose." My throat tightened at the word partnership. In the chaos of the investigation, we hadn't defined what was happening between us. It felt too new, too fragile to name, especially with the threat of criminal charges still hanging over our heads. "At least call someone," I insisted. "Let people know where you are, what we're doing." "Already did." She produced her phone, showing me a timed email scheduled to send to her lawyer in 24 hours unless she canceled it. Full details of our suspicions about Victor, including photos of the evidence we've gathered. I reached for her then, pulling her into a fierce hug. "When did you get so smart about criminal conspiracies?" "I watch a lot of true crime documentaries," she murmured against my neck, her arms tightening around my waist. We spent the evening developing a plan. The Hasselblad would remain visible in my workshop, bait for whoever might return. We installed motion-triggered cameras in discreet corners and moved essential evidence to a safety deposit box under Taylor's sister's name. That night, sleep proved elusive again. Every sound from the street below had us tensing, listening. Around 2 a.m., the distinct sound of glass breaking shattered the silence. "Workshop," I whispered, already on my feet. Taylor grabbed my arm. "Don't go down there. The cameras. We'll record whatever happens. If we confront them, we could get hurt." She was right, but standing by while someone broke into my shop felt impossible. I compromised by creeping to the apartment door, pressing my ear against it to listen for footsteps on the stairs. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of the workshop door opening and closing, followed by quiet footsteps approaching the staircase that led to my apartment. "They're coming up," I mouthed to Taylor, who was already dialing 911. We backed away from the door, retreating to the bedroom where I kept a baseball bat, a pathetic defense against whatever might be on the other side of that door, but better than nothing. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A shadow appeared under the door, followed by the gentle testing of the knob. Locked, thank God. Then came the metallic scrape of someone inserting a tool into the lock. Taylor's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tightly as she whispered into her phone. The lock clicked. The door began to open. I raised the bat, heart hammering in my chest. A familiar silhouette appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, confident in his movements. As moonlight from the window illuminated his face, my stomach dropped. "Victor," I breathed. He smiled, entirely unperturbed at being caught breaking in. "Good evening, ladies. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." "Put down the bat, Rose," Victor said calmly, as if he were asking me to pass the salt at dinner. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Taylor's fingers dug into my arm, her phone still pressed to her ear. "Police are on their way," she warned him. Victor merely smiled, stepping fully into the apartment and closing the door behind him. "I doubt that. Your call was likely rerouted to my associate outside. Technology is remarkable these days." My grip tightened on the bat. "What do you want?" "Originally, just the Hasselblad." He glanced around my apartment with detached interest. "But now I find myself needing to resolve a larger problem." "Us," Taylor said flatly. "Precisely." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You've been quite thorough in your amateur investigation, breaking into Marcus's gallery, gathering evidence, asking questions about my business practices. You've been stealing cameras and replacing them with forgeries," I said, finding courage in naming his crime aloud. Victor sighed, looking almost disappointed. "Such a reductive description of a sophisticated operation. I prefer to think of it as art appreciation optimization." "Call it whatever you want," Taylor snapped. "It's still theft and fraud." "Is it theft when the owners still possess what they believe to be their treasured items?" Victor spread his hands philosophically. "They retain the joy of ownership. My private clients enjoy the authenticity. Everyone's needs are satisfied." "Except for the truth," I said. Victor's expression hardened. "The truth is overrated. Perception is what matters." We were stalling, hoping against hope that Taylor had reached real emergency services before Victor's associate intercepted the call. Each second felt stretched, taut with tension. "How did you do it at the gallery?" I asked, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. Victor seemed pleased by the question. "Marcus has gambling debts, significant ones. I offered a solution that would benefit us both. He provided access, adjusted the security system, and created the perfect suspects." He nodded toward us. "The romantically involved newcomers with financial troubles and convenient expertise." "And our Leica?" Taylor asked quietly. "Currently being studied by my craftsmen. It's remarkable work, Rose. You have a gift." His expression turned calculating. A gift that could be quite lucrative if properly directed. I realized with a chill he was offering me a job, creating the forgeries he'd been commissioning. "I'll pass," I said coldly. Victor shrugged. "Unfortunate, but not unexpected." He reached into his jacket, producing a small pistol. "This changes our options considerably." Taylor stepped in front of me instinctively. I pulled her back, keeping the bat raised. "Now," Victor continued, "here's what's going to happen. We're going to collect the Hasselblad from your workshop and any evidence you've gathered. Then..." He broke off at the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside. Heavy, purposeful steps that didn't belong to his associate. "Police! Open up!" Relief flooded through me. Taylor must have gotten through after all. Victor's composure cracked for the first time. He glanced frantically between us and the door, gun wavering. "Drop it," I said, finding unexpected steadiness in my voice. "It's over, Victor." For a terrifying moment I thought he might shoot us both rather than surrender. Then the door burst open, and Detective Wells charged in with 2 uniformed officers, weapons drawn. "Drop the weapon," Wells shouted. Victor's hand opened, the pistol clattering to the floor. One of the officers kicked it away while the other cuffed him. "Are you both all right?" Wells asked, holstering her gun. I lowered the bat, suddenly aware that my arms were trembling with delayed shock. "How did you know to come?" Wells nodded toward Taylor. "Ms. Ward set up a direct line to me days ago, said she had evidence on the gallery theft but needed time to gather more proof. When she activated the emergency signal tonight, we moved." I turned to Taylor, astonished. You've been working with the police? Since when? Since I realized how dangerous Victor might be, she admitted. After our night at the gallery, I approached Detective Wells with our theory. You could have told me, I said, hurt slicing through the relief. I wanted to, but Wells insisted we keep it contained. The fewer people who knew, the safer you'd be. Detective Wells had moved to examine Victor's lock-picking tools, giving us a moment of semi-privacy. I was trying to protect you, Taylor whispered. Before I could respond, Wells called us over. We found your associate downstairs, Mr. Monroe. He's being quite cooperative already. Victor's aristocratic features had settled into cold disdain. My attorney will be in touch. Looking forward to it, Wells replied cheerfully. Meanwhile, we have a warrant to search your hotel suite and workshop. I'm particularly interested in a certain Leica camera. As they led Victor away, I felt the adrenaline drain from my body. Taylor reached for my hand, but I stepped back, still processing her deception. Rose. Not now, I said quietly. Wells returned after Victor was secured in a patrol car. We'll need both of you to come down to the station for statements, and I'll want to see this evidence you've been collecting. It's in a safety deposit box, Taylor said. I can get it first thing in the morning. Good. And Miss Powell, we found surveillance equipment in your workshop. Yours? I nodded. We installed it yesterday. Smart thinking. Those recordings will be useful. Wells handed us each her card. Station at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Try to get some rest. After the police left, silence settled over the apartment. Taylor stood awkwardly by the window, watching the patrol cars pull away. I did what I thought was best, she said finally. By not trusting me? By not risking you. There was a chance Victor had sources in the department. The fewer people who knew about Wells being involved, the safer the operation. Logic told me she was right, but emotion isn't logical. Since my father died, since my grandmother's cold parenting, trust had never come easily to me. I'd let Taylor past walls I'd maintained for years, only to discover she'd been keeping secrets. I need some air, I said, grabbing my jacket and keys. Rose, please. I'm not leaving, I clarified, seeing the fear in her eyes. I just need to think, alone. Outside, the night air was cool against my flushed skin. I sat on the steps of my building, looking up at stars barely visible through Glendale's light pollution. Victor was in custody. Our names would be cleared. The Leica would likely be recovered. So why did victory feel so hollow? 6 months can change everything, and nothing at all. The Leica had been recovered from Victor's workshop, along with several other stolen pieces. Victor and his associates were facing multiple felony charges. Marcus had made a deal with prosecutors, testifying against Victor in exchange for reduced charges. And I was back in my workshop, hands steady as I calibrated the aperture on a 1970 seconds Minolta. The bell above the door jingled. I didn't look up immediately, assuming it was the UPS driver with my parts delivery, but the familiar scent of sandalwood gave her away. Hello, Rose, Taylor said quietly. I finally raised my eyes from the workbench. She looked good, hair a bit shorter, same confident posture. 6 months had softened nothing between us. Taylor, I acknowledged, setting down my tools. I didn't expect to see you. After the night of Victor's arrest, things had unraveled quickly. I'd given my statement to Detective Wells. Taylor had produced the evidence from the safety deposit box, and our names had been cleared within days. The media had briefly celebrated us as the camera sleuths who broke the case. But trust, once broken, proved harder to restore than any vintage camera. I was in town for a photography auction, she explained, staying near the door as if uncertain of her welcome. Thought I'd stop by. The last time we'd spoken had been 3 weeks after the arrest. I'd told her I needed space, time to process everything. She'd respected that, perhaps too well. No calls, no texts, no showing up unannounced, until today. How's the collection? I asked, falling back on professional interest. Growing. I just acquired a Kodak Brownie from 1900s. A pause. Still not as special as the Leica, though. The Leica, our Leica, had been returned to us after being held as evidence. By then, I'd already packed up Taylor's half and mailed it to her address in San Francisco. A clean break. Detective Wells mentioned the trials starting next month, I said. wiping my hands on a cloth more thoroughly than necessary. "Will you testify?" I nodded. "You?" "First week." She took a tentative step into the workshop. "Rose, I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but now I'm here and what? And I miss you." The simple honesty in her voice cracked something in me. I miss us, whatever we were becoming. I set down the cloth, focusing on keeping my expression neutral. "We barely knew each other, Taylor. 3 weeks of investigation and adrenaline doesn't make a relationship. Doesn't it? Because it felt like more than that to me." Outside, rain began to fall, a gentle autumn shower that tapped against the workshop windows. The sound transported me back to that first night she'd walked me home, to the feeling of standing under her umbrella with possibilities stretching before us. "I made a mistake," she continued when I didn't respond. "I should have told you about contacting Wells, but everything else, how I felt about you, what I wanted for us, that was real. I'm not good at trust," I admitted finally. "My father left, my grandmother was cold. I grew up learning that people leave or let you down. When I found out you'd been working with Wells behind my back, it felt like betrayal," she finished softly. I nodded, the lump in my throat making speech difficult. "I brought something for you." Taylor reached into her bag, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Open it." Inside was a vintage camera case. I recognized it immediately, the one that had held our Leica. "Turn it over," she prompted. On the underside, a small brass plate had been affixed. Engraved on its surface were the words, "Powell and Ward, some things are worth restoring." "I had it made months ago," Taylor explained. "I've been carrying it around, waiting for the courage to bring it to you." The weight of the case in my hands felt significant, heavier than its physical components, laden with meaning and possibility. "I've never been good at apologies," Taylor continued, "or patience. But I've learned both these past 6 months." She took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for everything at once. Just coffee, conversation, a chance to rebuild." The rain picked up intensity outside, drumming against the roof in a comforting rhythm. Through the workshop windows, I could see pedestrians hurrying past with umbrellas and upturned collars, life continuing its normal pace while I stood at a crossroads. "I still have your umbrella," I said suddenly, surprising myself. Taylor blinked. "What?" "From that first night. The night you kissed me and then walked away in the rain. I never returned it." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I never asked for it back?" I ran my fingers over the brass plate again, feeling the engraved letters beneath my fingertips. "Some things are worth restoring, like cameras, like trust, like us." "There's a coffee shop around the corner," I said finally. "They make decent espresso." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't a promise or a declaration, but it was an opening, a willingness to try. Taylor's smile bloomed fully, lighting her eyes in that way I'd tried unsuccessfully to forget. "I'd like that." I grabbed my jacket and the umbrella, her umbrella, from the hook by the door. Outside, the rain created a silver curtain separating us from the rest of the world. "Ready?" Taylor asked, standing close enough that I could feel her warmth. I opened the umbrella, making room for her beneath it. Our shoulders touched as we stepped into the rain together, not quite where we'd been before, but no longer where we'd ended. "I knew you'd keep it," she said quietly, nodding toward the umbrella. "What?" "The umbrella. I left it on purpose that night." I looked at her in surprise. "You got soaked walking home." Taylor's eyes met mine, warm and certain. "Some things are worth getting a little wet for." As we walked through the rain-washed streets of Glendale, I felt something long dormant stirring back to life. Not quite trust, not quite love, but the possibility of both. And for now, possibility was enough.